think that I very much came to filmmaking out of a basic curiosity about what makes us human. And I think that's important. I think it's important to come to filmmaking not from a sense of stories you want to tell, a sense of knowing something already, but actually out of curiosity, a curiosity about what we are, what we come from, what is consciousness, what influences how we perceive, how we relate to each other. I didn't intend to study filmmaking. I went to college, university, to study theoretical physics and cosmology because I was interested in what existence is, why there is something rather than nothing. And yet it was a boring time in physics, at least to me. There was not yet the particle accelerator exploring the very nature of matter, and there was the results weren't yet coming in from the Hubble Space Telescope. String theory was not yet sort of being considered and explored. And so we were all being pushed into engineering and applied physics, and that was absolutely not what I wanted to do. So I left physics and started exploring philosophy and the questions of why we exist, what is consciousness, metaphysical questions. And I realized that philosophy was attempting to frame these questions in logical forms, but I felt that the real answers to these things might be in experience itself, might be in practice, and ways of finding new ways of exploring and perceiving the world. And I don't know exactly what happened, but I was on a glacier one day. In the middle of university, I'd taken a year out to work on a street theater project. I got a grant to work on a street theater project in Calcutta. And I'd gone traveling up into Pakistan and then was on a glacier, and it was pitch black. You would think a glacier is white. And I climbed and climbed and climbed to reach this glacier, and it was covered with dust and debris. And there I was sitting on it, and for some reason, I don't remember what was so upsetting to me that day, but I started to cry. I was crying about something. And on my way down from that emotional moment, I somehow knew I would return to university and change everything I was doing and become a filmmaker. I had no long-standing love of cinema. My memories of film as a child were traumatic or confused. I was the youngest, and so we would always go to see films that were too complicated for me to understand or too violent. I was therefore afraid most of the time, or weeping or hiding behind this chair in the cinema. But somehow I knew I would be a filmmaker, and for me, filmmaking is my way of, it's a kind of life journey through which I'm free to explore those aspects of the world which are most mysterious to me, most painful to me, most important to me. Exploring the most painful things, we overcome somehow our fear of looking. It's like a child overcomes his or her fear of the dark, and we become stronger and more adventurous still. And then, having explored these aspects of humanity that most intrigue and puzzle and puzzle me, I see the work of the film, of editing and putting together a film, not as storytelling, but as translating into a kind of poetic, visceral experience all of the wisdom and mystery that is encountered through the process of shooting and the first part of editing. So I see myself much more as an explorer than as a storyteller. Well, one thing I would say about the kind of work that I make that maybe is particularly useful for nonfiction filmmakers to hear, or aspiring nonfiction filmmakers. You see, I feel like there's a kind of false dichotomy in how we understand nonfiction, that either things are staged or you're observing a pre-existing reality. You're documenting a pre-existing reality. And I think very often when films pretend to be documenting a pre-existing reality, what they're really doing is working together with the filmmakers, working with her subjects or his subjects to simulate a reality in which they pretend the camera is not present. And when things are staged, we criticize it because there's an attempt to hide that fact, and yet somehow we feel there's a lack of authenticity. And I think nonfiction filmmakers could understand, would maybe benefit from two things that I feel I've discovered over the many years of making The Act of Killing and The Look of Silence. Namely, first of all, that the moment that whenever you film anybody, they will automatically start to stage themselves. And that moment of self-consciousness is not necessarily a liability. It's not necessarily something we should strive to get past as quickly as possible in order to get authenticity. Actually, the effort to stage themselves, the motives why a person feels the need to stage themselves, is authentic. It's insecurity, it's doubt, it's the gap between how one wants to see oneself and how in one's most dark moments one really sees oneself. And that's the very stuff of what we are. So if instead of seeing that moment of self-staging as something to get past, and instead seeing it as an opportunity, if we see it as an opportunity, the nonfiction film camera becomes precisely a prism, which makes visible the stories, the fantasies, the narratives, often secondhand, third-rate, borrowed from mainstream media, from social media, by which we know ourselves and know our world. I was recently at a concert, a big concert of Latin music, and everybody there was, instead of watching the concert, they were the whole time taking pictures of themselves watching the concert, and not just that, editing the pictures, Photoshop, touching up the pictures, and editing their video and sharing it. So this issue of self-consciousness, I think, is increasingly impossible to avoid, and we may as well embrace it and use it as a way of a crack through which we can gain insight into the role of the imagination in making us what we are and in constituting our understanding of existence.
Cool.
The second understanding, I think, of my work as a nonfiction filmmaker that I think allows us to transcend or move beyond this dichotomy between sort of so-called direct cinema, direct documentation of a pre-existing reality on the one hand, and the accusation that something's staged or inauthentic on the other, is actually an understanding of what we do as nonfiction filmmakers that is in fact common to all filmmakers, including fiction filmmakers. I think within the overall safe space of making a film, we take journeys with people, and we create, through our intimacy with the people we're working, we create occasions in which become sort of portals through which fundamentally insightful contradictions can be revealed. So within the overall safe space of making a film, these occasions become moments where everybody, ideally, not just participant, but also filmmaker, is pushed way beyond their comfort zone into a space where the most painful, vexing, and difficult issues that the film is exploring are becoming visible in authentic ways. And if we understand any documentary, including the masterpieces of direct cinema, as being that, then aspiring filmmakers can understand what documentarians or nonfiction filmmakers are doing when their work is actually successful. So we need to know ourselves, first of all. And an artist, anyone whose work is about trying to take a journey to the most important and painful and mysterious questions that we face as a species, had better make everything about that journey as comfortable as possible emotionally, and because what you're going to find there is not going to be comfortable. That's certain from the beginning. So it is important that we not start the journey accusing ourselves that we must work more quickly or we must work more carefully. We have to, I think it is all of our task. We all owe this to the world, to each other, to ourselves, and certainly to the people with whom we film. We have an obligation to ask the most important questions and not to shirk from our duty to give those the utmost seriousness. So for me, I start a project with a set of questions, a theme. In the case of both my films, the theme is impunity. In the act of killing, it's the boasting and the stories that the perpetrators are telling themselves to justify what they've done. In The Look of Silence, it's what does it do to human beings to have to live for 50 years in silence. And in both films, in The Look of Silence and particularly the uncut version of The Act of Killing, I do not stop the shooting or the editing until I feel I've gone as deeply as I possibly can. And I only stop shooting when working with the theme, the questions, a method that's devised specifically to answer those questions, and a set of characters. So I do not stop until I'm no longer getting deeper and I start moving sideways or just asking new sets of questions. That's when it's time to start editing. And then the editing is not a storytelling process where I want to show the viewer what happened in the shoot. The editing is about, for the most part, excavating the layers of meaning that I've uncovered through the shooting process, or that are excavating the layers of meaning in the footage that I've shot. I try to make my footage as multi-layered as possible, as dense as possible. And then only in the last third of the editing, perhaps, am I something like a storyteller. And even there, I see myself as creating immersive experiences rather than recounting stories. You see, the distinction might seem semantic, but it's really one of distance. A storyteller, you listen to a story. You are immersed, I hope, in my films, and there's a slight difference there, and I think it's a very important one when we remember that sound is a tactile medium, and cinema should be a tactile medium. I think it was important in my journey to making, that brought me to the starting point of shooting The Act of Killing and The Look of Silence. It was important to me over, at that point, 5 years or so, to make a series of more manageable works where I discovered the questions I was interested in the form, the language. It was also an exploration, and those works are sort of wildly experimental. I made a series of very short films, a half-an-hour film, a 50-minute film. And those, I don't think I could have just started off from zero and made The Act of Killing. And before I could even make The Act of Killing, I worked for half a year with Christine Sin and others to help plantation workers make the globalization tapes, whereupon I learned Indonesian. Then there was about 2 years from that time when we finished until I started making The Act of Killing, where I was first working with the survivors and then every perpetrator I could find. Some of that early material with the perpetrators is in The Look of Silence. So I think the lesson here is that you need to have laboratory spaces, I believe. And what that laboratory space looks like will change over the course of your development. For me, it was shorter films, but I always, at the beginning, but the longer of the shorter films, I always felt as kind of monumental works at the beginning. In hindsight, they're not. So I think I've always had that sense of ambition, that whatever I'm doing is as important as it could possibly be, even though in hindsight they're shorts. And I think there's time, but I think there's also times for the laboratory where you're just jumping in and making experiments, and times where you shouldn't do that, or at least I can't do that, and people shouldn't feel pressured to do that. The times for that, I think, are when you're defining a project, when you're looking for the questions you want to ask, when you have an argument or something that upsets you, but you don't yet know the characters with whom you will take the journey that will lead to that really deep exploration. And I would allow yourself those times to make things quickly. And I want to emphasize, this has nothing to do with the career building work of sending those out as calling cards and establishing yourself. I don't think that any of the early work I did was important to gaining the support that I ultimately gained in terms of to make The Look of Silence and The Act of Killing. I think that laboratory is for you creatively. It's not part of a business plan. It's not a career development. It's an artistic development. And once I really get sucked into a project, it's very hard for me to sort of focus on multiple projects. And people assume, oh, these 2 films took a decade, but you must have been doing many other things. There were things I had to do in order as sort of requirements for the funding, like we edited a book as part of an arts and humanities research grant in the United Kingdom at the very earliest stage as I finished a PhD. But really what I was doing, everything emotionally, artistically, once I started in 2003, 2004, 2005, everything was then focused on making these 2 films. And I had no qualms, although I had to convince myself not to, but I had no qualms about not churning things out.